This segment is sponsored by Hey Sandy PR. Libby Hikind is the queen of grants. Libby has an incredible life story, which includes getting her first grant, being the owner of the largest grant database in the country, writing a book, and now being a podcast host. Libby, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. I'm so glad to be here.
Yeah.
Washington is the capital of the United States, and the many grants come from the federal government, and they're on our website as well.
Absolutely. So let's start with that. Your first grant, tell us about that, and then how that was the motivation to start GrantWatch.com.
Well, I was a public school teacher, a young public school teacher, teaching a class that needed computers. There was a time in the early 1980s where there weren't computers in every classroom.
Right.
I mean, it's hard to believe, right?
Yeah.
And I needed them because I had to teach written communication skills so that my students could pass the statewide exams. And I just had this great idea. If I taught them word processing, then that would work, right?
Right.
And Radio Shack, Tandy Corporation, way back then, had a grant to prove that their Model 100, which was kind of like the first iPad, if you think about it, could work in an educational environment. And so I wrote it, and I always tell everyone, write your first grant yourself. If you don't succeed, you want to hire a grant writer, that's great. But if not, what if you're like me and you win?
Right.
You'll be sitting here in a couple of years.
Yeah, what a fascinating story, and that kind of leads us to the book now, The Queen of Grants. Tell us about the book and when the second one is coming, because we were talking about a second one.
Right. What I did in the book was the first chapter tells you my story. Why? And, you know, if you want to write grants, why do you need to know my story? Because if I can do it, you can do it too, and I want you to know that. And I go through all the twists and turns that get me to where I am today. And then I go into how to write a grant. And I answer all your questions that you've ever thought about writing grants. And then I model some grants. I go into every section, and it really brings to somebody's table a new career.
Wow.
And I want people to have that. There's a whole new crop of young people that want to write grants. They're entering the nonprofit sphere. They're opening businesses, and they need to know that.
Well, let's talk a little bit more now about when you wrote that first grant. Did you think that you'd someday become a podcast host as well?
No. The podcast came about because I wrote the book, okay? Yeah. So after the book, I realized I had a journey. But everybody else who writes grants also has a journey, and they have so much to offer. So let's get that out there. Let's listen to what they say and what they're putting into grants and what's important. And then I took it a step further and I started interviewing funding sources.
Wow.
What are they looking for? And so if it's a funding source up in Westchester, New York, why is that pertinent to somebody in Virginia or Maryland or Washington? Because funding sources are all looking for the same thing. They want to see what's the impact on the community. Did you follow directions? You know, do you have the organizational capacity behind you? So that's what we're hearing, and it keeps going on and on and on. We're just expanding, and then we're starting a B2B segment.
Wow.
So it's just growing, and it's so wonderful.
That's wonderful. What's the name of the podcast, and how can people find it?
The podcast is called GrantTalk, and it is on GrantWatch. And I just have to tell you, we interviewed these farmers from Mississippi. They got their first grant. And they then applied for more and more, and now they give grants. They are now a funding source. Wow. Okay, and they're teaching farmers how to have sustainable farms, how to run a farm like a business, and that's what's happening out there.
How can people get on the podcast and share their stories?
Just write to us, media@grantwatch.com.
Libby, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having us.